The first punch landed before Lydia Hale could even drop her traveling bag. Not from fists, but from words sharp enough to draw blood. "That's what he ordered?" A woman's voice cut through the crowd at the train platform. "Lord have mercy on his desperate soul." Laughter erupted like gunfire. Lydia's fingers tightened around her worn satchel, her face burning, but she didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that looking up only invited more cruelty. Somewhere in this godforsaken frontier town, a man named Caleb Rourke was waiting for his mail-order bride, a man who'd promised her nothing but a roof and work. She should have known even that was too much to hope for. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see just how far this journey travels. The platform at Coldwater Station wasn't much more than weathered planks and peeling paint, but it served its purpose. It separated arrivals from the decent folk of town. Lydia stood on those planks now, feeling every eye on her like brands against skin. The train had already pulled away, belching black smoke into the pale October sky, leaving her stranded in a silence thick with judgment. She was 26 years old, plain-faced and broad-shouldered, with hands that showed too many years of hard labor and a figure that had never fit the delicate ideal of femininity. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face her own mother had once called unfortunate, strong-jawed, with eyes too direct and a mouth too wide. The dress she wore was clean but old, mended in places, chosen because it was her only decent option, not because it flattered. "Is someone coming for you, miss?" The station master's voice held false politeness, the kind that barely masked contempt. "My husband," Lydia said quietly, the word foreign on her tongue. "Caleb Rourke." The station master's eyebrows rose. Behind him, a cluster of women who'd been pretending not to stare suddenly stopped pretending altogether. One of them, a blonde woman in an expensive green traveling suit, laughed outright. "Rourke actually went through with it," the blonde woman said to her companion. "I heard he'd placed an ad back east, but I assumed no one would be desperate enough to answer." "Apparently desperation has no limits," her companion replied, not bothering to lower her voice. "Though I suppose it works both ways. A man like Rourke can't afford to be particular." Lydia's face burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for whoever was meant to collect her. The town of Coldwater spread before her in various shades of brown. Buildings weathered by wind and sun, streets churned to mud by recent rain, mountains rising harsh and unforgiving in the distance. It was a place that looked like it tolerated no weakness, and Lydia wondered if she'd finally found somewhere she might fit, even if the fitting was nothing more than two ill-matched pieces forced together by circumstance. The sound of hooves and wagon wheels broke through the whispers. A man drove toward the station in a wagon that had seen better days, pulled by two horses that looked barely better fed than the vehicle they drew. He didn't hurry. Everything about his approach suggested a man completing an unpleasant but necessary task. Caleb Rourke was not what Lydia had imagined, though she'd tried hard not to imagine anything at all. He was perhaps 35, tall and lean in the way of men who ate irregularly and worked constantly. His face was all hard angles, sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with a knife, eyes the color of steel that assessed her with the same enthusiasm one might show a horse of questionable value. He wore work clothes that had been clean once, maybe that morning, but were already marked with dust and sweat. His hands on the reins were scarred and calloused, and he didn't remove his hat when he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Lydia Hale?" His voice was rough, like gravel underfoot. "Yes." He nodded once as if confirming a disappointing suspicion. "Put your bag in the back." No greeting, no welcome, not even a proper acknowledgement that she'd just traveled 800 miles to a complete unknown. Lydia lifted her satchel, everything she owned fit in one bag, and placed it in the wagon bed. When she turned back, Caleb hadn't moved to help her up. "You able to climb up yourself, or you need assistance?" The women on the platform tittered. Lydia felt the weight of their amusement, their satisfaction at watching this graceless transaction. She gripped the wagon side and pulled herself up onto the bench, her movements efficient, if not elegant. Caleb didn't wait for her to settle before he snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. They rode in silence through Coldwater's main street. It was a Saturday, and the town was busy with weekend commerce. Ranchers restocking supplies, women doing their shopping, Men gathered outside the saloon even at this early hour. Every head turned to watch them pass. Lydia kept her eyes forward, but she felt their stares like physical touches, assessing, judging, finding her wanting. "The general store's there," Caleb said abruptly, gesturing with his chin. "You'll need to place orders through them. I've got an account. Mercantile's next to it. Butcher's across the way. Church is at the end of town if you're inclined." "I'm not." It was the most he'd said since collecting her, delivered in the same flat tone he might use to describe fence posts. Lydia nodded, cataloging the information. "Doctor's office is above the apothecary. Nearest neighbor is the Morrison Ranch, about 5 miles east. We don't socialize." "I understand." He glanced at her then, quick and sharp. "Do you?" "You made your terms clear in your letters, Mr. Rourke. I'm here to work, not to be entertained or to entertain. I don't expect more than what was agreed." Something flickered in his expression, too fast to read. "It's Caleb. No point in formalities." "Caleb," she repeated. He grunted and returned his attention to the road. They left Coldwater behind, and the landscape opened into rolling grassland broken by rocky outcrops and stands of pine. The ranch, when it finally appeared, was exactly what Lydia had expected, functional and austere. A main house built from rough-hewn logs, a barn that leaned slightly to one side, various outbuildings in states of disrepair, and corrals that held a few horses and cattle. Everything spoke of a man working alone, doing the minimum necessary to keep operations running. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a small cabin set apart from the main house. It was barely more than a shed, really, one room with a slanted roof and a single window. "That's yours," he said. "Stoveworks. Wells between here and the main house. Privy's behind. You'll find what you need inside." Lydia stared at the cabin, understanding crystallizing cold and hard in her chest. This was not a marriage in any real sense. This was an employment arrangement with legal papers attached. "What about the main house?" "That's mine." Caleb's voice held a warning edge. "You'll take your meals there, do your work there, but you sleep here." That was the arrangement. The letters didn't specify separate living quarters. Then I'm specifying it now. He finally looked at her directly, and his eyes held nothing soft. "I need someone to keep house, cook, handle the indoor work I don't have time for. In exchange, you get food, shelter, and a name that's better than nothing. But I'm not interested in pretending this is something it's not. You want affection or companionship, you came to the wrong place." Lydia held his gaze, refusing to look away first. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. My family made it clear I was a burden they were happy to be rid of. You offered practical terms for a practical arrangement. I don't need affection, Caleb. I need to survive. If that means I work myself to the bone in exchange for food and a roof, then that's better than what I had." For a moment, something almost like respect crossed his features. Then it was gone, replaced by the same harsh indifference. "Good. We understand each other." He gestured to the cabin. "Get settled. Supper's at 6. Don't be late." He didn't help her down from the wagon, didn't carry her bag, didn't wait to see if she had questions. He simply drove the wagon toward the barn, leaving her standing in the dust. Lydia picked up her satchel and walked to the cabin. The door stuck, swollen from moisture, and she had to shoulder it open. Inside was exactly what he'd promised: a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small stove, a table barely large enough for one person, and a single chair. A trunk sat in the corner, empty and waiting. The window was dirty, filtering the afternoon light into something gray and weak. She set her bag on the bed and looked around at her new home. It was cold, sparse, lonely, but it was hers in a way nothing had ever been before. No one would enter without permission. No one would mock her here. No one would remind her that she was unwanted. Lydia unpacked methodically, hanging her 2 other dresses on pegs driven into the wall, placing her brush and small mirror on the table, storing her undergarments and personal items in the trunk. Everything she owned fit easily with room to spare. When she finished, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one moment of complete honesty. She was terrified. Not of Caleb. His coldness was at least predictable. She was terrified that even this bare minimum existence, would somehow be too much. That she would fail at the one thing she'd always been able to do, work hard enough to justify her presence, that the town's contempt would wear her down until she became what they already believed her to be, worthless. But she'd learned long ago that terror was just another thing to carry, like water or firewood. You didn't have to enjoy it, you just had to keep moving. At 5:30, she left the cabin and walked to the main house. The interior was as rough as the exterior, a large main room that served as kitchen and living area, with two doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Dishes were piled in the sink, the floor was tracked with mud, and everything had the dusty, neglected look of a place where cleaning happened only when absolutely necessary. Caleb was washing up at the basin, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. He didn't turn when she entered. "Pantry's there," he said, nodding toward a door. "Cellar's outside, around back. I usually just fry whatever meat's available and boil some potatoes. You can do better, I expect." It wasn't a question. Lydia surveyed the kitchen with a practiced eye, cataloging what was available, what was missing, what was salvageable. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Define proper. "Something that didn't come from a tin or get fried in the same pan you used yesterday without washing." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "Probably spring." Lydia rolled up her sleeves. "Sit down. This will take a while." She expected him to argue, to assert some authority, but he just dried his hands and sat at the rough-hewn table watching her work. She found flour, lard, a few eggs that were probably older than ideal but still usable. In the cellar, she discovered potatoes, onions, and surprisingly a few carrots. Canned goods filled one shelf: beans, tomatoes, peaches. In the pantry, she found spices and salt, and a slab of bacon that needed using soon. She worked in silence, her hands moving through familiar motions. Bacon into the pan, fat rendering down. Potatoes peeled and cut, onions chopped fine, eggs beaten with a splash of water. She made a hash that was simple but substantially better than anything Caleb had described, biscuits that required patience and proper temperature, and strong coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of boiled dirt. When she set the plate in front of him, Caleb stared at it like he'd forgotten food could look like that. "You know how to cook." It was an observation, not a compliment. "I know how to work. Cooking is part of that." He ate without speaking, methodically clearing his plate. When he finished, he stood, carried his dishes to the sink, and paused. "You'll find what you need for cleaning in the pantry. If something's missing, add it to the list for the general store. I go into town every other Wednesday." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "The work here is hard. I'm up before dawn, usually don't finish until after dark. I don't expect you to keep those hours, but I expect the house kept, meals ready, and supplies managed. If you can handle laundry and mending, that's extra. Questions?" "When do you want breakfast?" 5:30. "I'll be ready." He nodded once and left, his boots heavy on the porch steps. Through the window, she watched him walk back toward the barn, his shoulders set against the coming night. Lydia cleaned the kitchen until it shone, scrubbing away layers of neglect. She found mouse droppings behind the stove and evidence of larger pests in the pantry. The floor needed proper washing, the windows were opaque with dirt, and the cupboards required a complete emptying and reorganization. It was nearly 9 o'clock when she finally finished, her back aching and her hands raw. She walked back to her cabin in darkness, guided by moonlight. Inside, she lit the single lamp and prepared for bed. The mattress was thin and the blankets inadequate for the mountain cold, but she'd slept in worse. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside and the settling sounds of an unfamiliar building. Tomorrow would begin her real test. Caleb had made his expectations clear. This was a business arrangement, nothing more. She would work, he would provide, and neither would pretend there was anything else between them. It was honest, at least. More honest than her family's false affection, which had evaporated the moment she became inconvenient. She thought about the women at the train station, their mocking laughter, their satisfied cruelty. She thought about Caleb's assessment of her, cold and practical as evaluating livestock. She thought about the cabin's bare walls and empty spaces, the physical manifestation of her worth. And then she stopped thinking about any of it, because thinking changed nothing. Work changed things. Results changed things. She would prove her value the only way she knew how, by making herself indispensable. Sleep came eventually, dreamless and brief. The rooster that woke her at 4:30 was loud enough to wake the dead. Lydia dressed quickly in the darkness, brushed her hair and pinned it back, and made her way to the main house by lamplight. Caleb was already up, feeding the horses in the barn, but the house was cold and dark. She started the stove, put coffee on to boil, and began breakfast. By the time Caleb returned, the kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of frying eggs and fresh biscuits. He stopped in the doorway, surprise flickering across his features before being buried under habitual stoicism. "You're early." "Better early than late." He washed up and sat down, and they ate in silence. When he finished, he stood and reached for his hat. "I'll be working the north pasture today, checking fence lines. Should be back around noon. If you need anything, Morrison's ranch is 5 miles east, you mentioned." He grunted. "Right." He paused at the door again, seeming to struggle with something. "The town, people here talk. They've got opinions about most things and no hesitation sharing them. If you go into town, they'll likely have plenty to say about us. About you." "I'm aware. Just don't let them run you off. That's what they'll try to do." It was the closest thing to concern he'd shown, and it surprised her more than his earlier coldness. "I've survived worse than gossip, Caleb." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you have." After he left, Lydia surveyed her domain. The house was larger than she'd thought. 3 rooms total. The main room, Caleb's bedroom, which she wouldn't enter, and a smaller bedroom that was being used for storage. She started with the main room, moving every piece of furniture, scrubbing floors, beating rugs, washing windows until they actually let in light. She found years of accumulated dirt, broken tools that had been shoved in corners, papers that needed sorting. By noon, when Caleb returned for the midday meal, the transformation was remarkable. He stopped in the doorway and stared. "You did all this in one morning?" "I did what needed doing." She set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of him. "There's more work to be done, but it's a start." He ate slowly, his eyes moving around the room, taking in the changes. When he finished, he didn't immediately leave. "Lydia." Her name sounded strange in his rough voice. "This arrangement we have, I meant what I said. I'm not looking for anything beyond the practical, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate competent work when I see it." It was probably the closest he'd come to a compliment in years. Lydia nodded. "Understood. If you need anything, tools, supplies, whatever, just say so. I don't expect you to work miracles with nothing." "I'll make a list." He left again, and she returned to her work. By evening, the house looked like a different place entirely. She'd even managed to tackle the storage room, discovering it had potential as a proper pantry or workroom. When Caleb returned for supper, stew made from salt pork and vegetables, with bread she'd managed to bake properly despite the temperamental stove, he ate 3 helpings. "You keep cooking like this, I might actually survive the winter," he said, and there was something almost like warmth in his voice. "That's the idea." The pattern repeated itself over the next week. Caleb worked from dawn to dusk. She transformed the house inch by inch, and they maintained their careful distance. But small things began to shift. He started leaving notes about what needed doing, fence posts that required replacing, tools that needed repair, supplies running low. She started leaving notes in return, questions about his preferences, suggestions for improvements, requests for specific items. They were still strangers, still bound by an arrangement rather than affection, but they were learning each other's rhythms, the give and take of 2 people sharing space without touching. On Wednesday, Caleb went into town for supplies. He took Lydia's list: flour, sugar, better coffee, fabric for new curtains, seeds for a garden she wanted to start in spring. When he returned, his face was set in harder lines than usual. "Town's talking," he said without preamble, unloading the wagon. "About us. About you." "What are they saying?" "The usual nonsense, that I must be desperate, that you must be worse than desperate, that the whole arrangement is unnatural." He hefted a sack of flour with more force than necessary. "Bunch of bored idiots with nothing better to do than mind other people's business." "Does it bother you, what they say?" He stopped and looked at her directly. "I stopped caring what this town thinks about me years ago, but you're new. It might be different for you." "I stopped caring what people think before I ever came here." Lydia took the fabric from the wagon. Good quality, better than she'd expected. "Thank you for this." "You said you needed it." "Most men wouldn't have listened. Most men are fools." He hauled the last of the supplies inside, then paused in the doorway. There's a town gathering next month, harvest celebration or some such. We're expected to attend. It would look strange if we didn't. Lydia's stomach tightened. I see. You don't have to go. I can make an excuse. No. She straightened her shoulders. We'll go. Let them say what they want. They'll say it whether we're there or not. Something like approval flickered in his eyes. All right then. That night, alone in her cabin, Lydia allowed herself a moment of doubt. A town gathering meant scrutiny, meant facing all those people who'd laughed at the train station, meant enduring their judgment in a concentrated dose. But hiding would only confirm what they already believed, that she was ashamed, defeated, less than. She'd spent too much of her life making herself small, trying to disappear into the background of other people's lives. Maybe it was time to stop shrinking. The next morning, she asked Caleb a question she'd been holding back. Why did you place that ad? Why marry at all if you don't want a real marriage? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, this ranch is too much for one person. I needed help, but I couldn't afford to hire anyone. And legally, there are things, property rights, inheritance, things that require a wife. He poured himself more coffee. Love is a luxury for people who have time for it. I don't. What happened to make you think that? His jaw tightened. That's not part of our arrangement. Fair enough. But she'd seen something in his expression, a flash of old pain quickly buried. Caleb Rourke hadn't always been this hard, this closed off. Something had made him this way, had convinced him that feeling was weakness. Lydia understood that better than he knew. She'd learned early that vulnerability invited cruelty, that showing hurt only encouraged more of it. They were alike in that way, she and Caleb, both trying to survive in a world that punished softness. Maybe that's why this arrangement worked. Two damaged people, keeping careful distance, asking nothing from each other that couldn't be measured in work and provision. It should have been enough. But as the days passed and the house transformed under her hands, as she learned that Caleb took his coffee black and strong, that he had a barely there sense of humor that emerged in dry observations about the weather or the livestock, that he couldn't read very well but was too proud to admit it, that he sometimes stood on the porch in the evening and stared at the mountains with an expression of such loneliness it made her chest ache. As all these small revelations accumulated, Lydia began to realize that enough was a relative term, and that might be the most dangerous thing of all. The first hard frost came in late October, coating the ranch in crystalline white that turned the morning into something almost beautiful. Lydia stood at the window of her cabin, watching her breath fog the glass, and realized she'd been at the Rourke Ranch for nearly a month. 4 weeks of relentless work, careful silence, and a routine that had settled into something almost comfortable. Almost. She dressed quickly in the frigid air and made her way to the main house. Caleb was already in the kitchen, trying to coax life from the stove with hands that were raw from cold and rough use. He'd torn his knuckles on something, barbed wire probably, and blood seeped through the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around his right hand. Let me see that, Lydia said, setting down the basket of eggs she'd collected from the henhouse. It's fine. It's bleeding through. Sit down. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, assert his independence in that stubborn way he had. But something in her tone, not quite commanding but utterly certain, made him comply. He sat at the table while she heated water and retrieved the medical supplies she'd organized into a proper kit during her first week. His hand was worse than he'd let on. The cuts were deep, dirt ground into the wounds. She cleaned them methodically, her touch gentle but efficient, ignoring his sharp intakes of breath when the carbolic solution hit raw flesh. You should have come in when this happened, she said, wrapping clean bandages. Infection out here can kill you as surely as anything else. I had work to finish. The work will still be there tomorrow. You won't be much use if you lose the hand to gangrene. He watched her face as she tied off the bandage, his expression unreadable. You sound like you've done this before. My father was a logger. Men came home torn up regularly. She released his hand and began putting supplies away. I learned early that being squeamish was a luxury we couldn't afford. Your father, is he the one who sent you here? He's dead. 3 years now, crushed by a falling tree. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she'd learned to speak about pain, without inflection, without invitation for pity. After that, it was just my mother and my brother Thomas. Mother remarried last spring. Her new husband made it clear I wasn't part of the arrangement. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And your brother? Lydia's hand stilled on the medical kit. Thomas believed I should be grateful for any man willing to take me, regardless of the terms. When you posted that ad, he saw an opportunity to solve his problem. You were a problem to solve. Apparently, she closed the kit with more force than necessary. But that makes two of us, doesn't it? You needed help you couldn't afford. I needed somewhere to go. We both solved each other's problems. That's one way to look at it. He flexed his bandaged hand, testing the wrapping. The other way is that we both got exactly what we deserved, a loveless arrangement in the middle of nowhere with someone we'll never really know. The bitterness in his voice was new, raw enough that it told her more than any of his careful deflections. You're right, Lydia said quietly. We probably deserve exactly this. But deserving and accepting aren't the same thing. We can deserve loneliness and still decide not to settle for it. He looked at her sharply. I thought we understood each other. This isn't... I'm not asking for anything, Caleb. I'm just saying that working alongside someone doesn't have to mean staying strangers. She moved to the stove, began preparing breakfast. You want your coffee in silence? I'll give you silence. But if you want to talk sometimes, I'm capable of that too. He stood abruptly, grabbing his coat. I'll be in the north pasture. There's a section of fence that needs replacing before the snow comes. With that hand? It's wrapped, isn't it? Wrapping doesn't mean healed. Give it a day at least. I don't have a day to give. But he hesitated at the door, his back to her. The work doesn't stop because I'm hurt, Lydia. If I fall behind now, we pay for it all winter. Then let me help. He turned, disbelief clear on his face. You don't know anything about fence work. I can learn. I can hand you tools, hold posts steady, whatever you need. Two people work faster than one, even if one of them doesn't know what they're doing yet. It's cold out there. Hard work. I'm aware. I've been carrying water and chopping wood and managing a household in this cold for weeks. I think I can handle fence posts. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around the eyes. You're stubborn. So are you. The difference is I'm stubborn and offering to help. He considered this, weighing his pride against practical necessity. Pride lost. Fine. But you do exactly what I say when I say it. Fence work is dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. Understood. They worked through the morning in the bitter cold, Lydia learning the brutal arithmetic of frontier survival. How to dig post holes in half-frozen ground, how to stretch wire tight without tearing her hands apart, how to hammer without smashing her fingers. Caleb was a harsh teacher, economical with words and impatient with mistakes, but she noticed he adjusted his expectations as they went, finding tasks that matched her growing competence. By midday, they'd replaced 30 feet of fence. It wasn't much, but it was progress. You're stronger than you look, Caleb said as they stopped to eat the cold lunch she'd packed. Most women would have quit hours ago. Most women haven't spent their lives being told they're built more for labor than ladyhood. Lydia bit into the bread and cheese, too hungry to care about Grace. Besides, I told you. I know how to work. You did. He ate in silence for a moment, then added, I misjudged you. It wasn't an apology. Caleb seemed incapable of those. But it was acknowledgement, and that meant something. How so? I thought you'd be, softer, more demanding. I thought you'd complain about the cabin, the isolation, the work. Instead, you just, he gestured vaguely, handle it. What choice do I have? Complaining doesn't make the work disappear. It just makes everyone miserable while the work still waits. She wrapped the remains of her lunch, saving it for later. My mother used to say I was built without proper feelings. Maybe she was right. That's not true. The certainty in his voice surprised her. How would you know? Because I've seen you with the animals. The way you talk to the chickens when you collect eggs, like they're friends. The way you saved that runt piglet last week, feeding it by hand when I said it wasn't worth the effort. You feel things plenty. You're just smart enough not to show it to people who'd use it against you. Lydia stared at him, something cracking open in her chest. No one had ever observed her closely enough to notice those small tenderness, let alone defend them. We should get back to work, she said, her voice rougher than intended. Weather's turning. They worked until the light failed, then returned to the house in twilight. Lydia's hands were blistered despite the gloves, her back screaming from unfamiliar labor, but there was satisfaction in the ache. They'd accomplished something together, worked as a team instead of two separate people occupying the same space. Over supper, venison stew that had been simmering all day, filling the house with rich aroma. Caleb told her about the ranch, how he'd bought it 5 years ago with money saved from working as a trail hand, how he'd built everything with his own hands, how he'd planned to make it into something substantial before realizing the work was too much for one person. I tried hiring help, he said, sopping up gravy with bread, but hands drift. They work a season and move on. I needed someone permanent, someone with stake in keeping the place running. He looked at her directly. I never meant for it to be cruel, Lydia. The separate cabins, the distance. I just didn't want you to expect something I couldn't give. And what couldn't you give? His face closed off immediately, walls slamming back into place. It doesn't matter. Caleb. It doesn't matter, he repeated, standing abruptly. Thank you for supper, and for the help today. I'll see you at breakfast. He left before she could respond, and Lydia sat alone in the kitchen, frustrated by the glimpse of vulnerability, immediately shuddered. Caleb was like a door that kept opening a crack before slamming shut, offering just enough light to make the darkness more obvious. But she was patient. She'd learned patience the hard way, through years of waiting for cruelty to pass, for situations to improve, for life to offer something better. She could wait for Caleb to trust her, if he ever would. The next 2 weeks brought the first serious snow, blanketing the ranch in white silence. The work shifted to winter tasks, ensuring the livestock had shelter, stockpiling feed, maintaining equipment, keeping paths clear. Lydia and Caleb fell into an easier rhythm, working together more often than not, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. She learned that Caleb had been orphaned young, raised by an uncle who drank away what little money they had, that he'd left home at 14 and never looked back, that he'd seen most of the West before settling here, driven by some restless dissatisfaction with everywhere else. He learned that Lydia had taught herself to read using her father's Bible and old newspapers, that she'd once wanted to be a teacher until her mother told her no school would hire someone so plain, that she kept a journal where she wrote observations about birds and weather and the small beauties most people overlooked. They didn't talk about feelings or futures or what exactly their arrangement meant, but they talked, and that was more than either had expected. Then Thomas arrived. It was a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the town's harvest gathering. Lydia was in the main house preparing bread when she heard the horse approach. Through the window, she saw a man dismount, stocky, fair-haired, with the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed the eyes. Her stomach dropped. "Lydia!" Thomas's voice carried across the yard, jovial and false. "Sister, where are you?" She stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands, keeping her expression neutral. "Thomas, this is unexpected. Can a man visit his sister?" He climbed the steps, reaching to embrace her. She stepped back. "You made it clear when I left that we were finished with family obligations. What do you want?" His smile hardened. "That's a cold greeting. Here I've ridden all this way to check on your welfare, and you treat me like a stranger." "You are a stranger. We grew up in the same house, but you never treated me like family. Not after Father died." She crossed her arms. "Again, what do you want?" Thomas's expression shifted, the false warmth dropping away to reveal the calculating coldness beneath. "I need money. Mother's husband turned out to be less solvent than advertised. They're struggling, and as your only brother, I thought you'd want to help. By asking me for money I don't have, but your husband does. Man owns a ranch. He's got resources." Thomas glanced around the property, assessing. "This is decent land. He could spare something for family in need. This ranch barely supports 2 people. And even if Caleb had money to spare, why would he give it to you? Because you're his wife. Because family helps family. Because—" Thomas stepped closer, his voice dropping to something uglier. "It would be a shame if certain facts about your past came to light, things that might make your new husband reconsider this arrangement." Ice flooded Lydia's veins. "What are you talking about?" "The real reason Mother's husband didn't want you around. The accusations from the merchant's son. The questions about whether something inappropriate happened." "Nothing happened," Lydia said, her voice shaking with rage. "He tried to force himself on me, and when I fought back, he claimed I'd encouraged him. His family had money and reputation. Mine didn't, but nothing happened." "I know that," Thomas said with a shrug. "But does your husband?" Would he believe you if someone told him his wife had been accused of unseemly behavior? This is a small community, Lydia. Reputation is everything. One word from me in town and what? Both of them turned. Caleb stood at the corner of the house, and his expression was colder than the winter wind. How long he'd been there, how much he'd heard, Lydia couldn't tell. Thomas recovered quickly, pasting on his friendly smile. You must be Rourke. I'm Thomas Hale, Lydia's brother. Just came by to check on my sister, make sure she's being treated well. I heard what you said. Caleb walked toward them with deliberate slowness, and there was something in his movements that made Thomas step back. Sounded less like concern and more like extortion. Now that's a harsh word. Get off my property. Thomas's smile vanished. I'm just asking for a little family assistance. Surely you can understand. I understand that you're trying to blackmail your own sister with lies. Caleb stopped a few feet away, and though he was leaner than Thomas, there was no question who was more dangerous. I understand that you treated her like a burden, threw her away when she was inconvenient, and now you want to profit from her situation. And I understand that you have about 10 seconds to get on that horse and ride out before I make you leave. You can't threaten me. I have rights. You have nothing. No claim to this land, no claim to my wife, no claim to anything here. Caleb's voice was perfectly calm, which somehow made it more frightening. And if you spread lies about Lydia in town, if you so much as speak her name, I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. The kind who extorts his own sister. The kind who runs when things get difficult. The kind who hides behind a woman's reputation because he's too weak to build his own. Thomas's face flushed red. She's not worth this. She's plain and useless, and you're a fool for thinking otherwise. Caleb moved fast, grabbing Thomas by the collar and hauling him close. Get out, now! Something in Caleb's eyes must have convinced Thomas he meant it. He jerked away, stumbling toward his horse. You deserve each other, he spat. Two miserable people in this God-forsaken place. I hope you freeze together. He mounted and rode off, kicking his horse harder than necessary. They watched until he disappeared over the ridge. Lydia realized she was shaking, not from fear, from rage and relief, and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. Caleb turned to her, his expression softening slightly. You all right? He's lying, she said immediately. What he said about the merchant's son, it wasn't true. I know. She stopped. What? I know. I heard enough to understand what really happened. His jaw tightened. And even if I hadn't heard, I know you. You don't have it in you to manipulate or deceive. You're too brutally honest for that. Tears threatened, unexpected, and unwelcome. She blinked them back fiercely. You didn't have to defend me. Yes, I did. Why? This is just an arrangement. You said yourself you didn't want... I said I didn't want affection or pretense, Caleb interrupted. But that doesn't mean I'll stand by while someone tries to hurt you. You're my wife, Lydia. On paper, legally, in the eyes of everyone who matters. That means something, even if it's not what most people would call a marriage. It means I protect you. It means what's mine is yours. And it sure as hell means I don't let your bastard brother threaten you on my property. The fierceness in his voice, the absolute conviction, broke something in her. The tears came despite her best efforts, hot and mortifying. Don't, she said, turning away. Don't be kind to me right now. I can handle cruelty. I don't know what to do with kindness. She heard him move closer, felt his presence behind her. Lydia. I'm fine. I just need a minute. You're not fine, you're crying. He sounded uncertain, like he'd wandered into territory without a map. I'm not good at this. Comforting people. Then don't try. Just let me... His hand settled on her shoulder, awkward and tentative. He's gone. He won't come back. And if he does, I'll deal with him. You don't have to be afraid. I'm not afraid of him, Lydia said, wiping her eyes roughly. I'm afraid of this. This? Caring, mattering, having someone stand up for me. She turned to face him, not caring anymore if he saw her tears. I came here expecting nothing, wanting nothing. It was safer that way, but you keep doing things like this, and I don't know how to stop myself from... She cut herself off, horrified at what she'd almost admitted. Caleb's expression was unreadable. From what? From hoping, she whispered.
from thinking this might be more than just survival.
The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything neither knew how to say. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice rough. I can't promise you what you deserve. I don't know how to be what people expect a husband to be, but I can promise you this. You matter here, to this ranch, to the work, to... He struggled, the words clearly difficult. To me. Maybe not in the way you want, but you matter. And I won't let anyone make you feel like you don't. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even close. But it was honest, and it was more than Lydia had dared hope for. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded, awkward again, and removed his hand from her shoulder. I should check the livestock. You do whatever you need to do. He left her standing on the porch, and Lydia watched him walk toward the barn with that stiff, self-conscious gait that told her he was as shaken as she was. Something had shifted between them. Not everything. Caleb was still Caleb, guarded and damaged and determined to keep distance. But a wall had cracked, just a little, and light was seeping through. That night, Lydia sat in her cabin and wrote in her journal by lamplight. She wrote about Thomas's visit, about Caleb's defense, about the strange ache in her chest that felt like hope and terror tangled together. She wrote until her hand cramped and the lamp oil ran low, trying to make sense of what she was feeling. The truth was simple and complicated. She was falling in love with her husband. It was the worst possible thing she could do. Caleb had been clear about his limits, his inability to offer anything beyond practical partnership. Loving him would only lead to heartbreak, to wanting things he couldn't give, to suffering in silence while pretending she felt nothing. But knowing that didn't stop it from happening. Over the next week, Lydia tried to maintain distance, to rebuild the careful walls she'd let slip. But it was impossible. Every small interaction revealed more of who Caleb was beneath the hardness. The way he left wildflowers on the kitchen table without explanation. The way he'd repaired her cabin's window without being asked. The way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that might have been longing if she let herself believe it. The harvest gathering loomed closer, and with it, the prospect of facing the town together. Caleb reminded her twice that she didn't have to attend, that he could make excuses. Each time, she told him she'd go. She would face them, all of them. The women who'd laughed at the train station, the merchants who'd sneered at her in the general store, the respectable families who'd made their judgment clear. She would stand beside Caleb and let them see that she hadn't broken, hadn't run, hadn't disappeared into the background like they expected. On the morning of the gathering, Lydia put on her best dress, dark blue wool, simple but clean, and pinned her hair carefully. When she looked in the small mirror, she saw the same plain face she'd always seen, the same sturdy body that had never fit anyone's ideal. But she saw something else too, strength, resilience, the kind of beauty that came from surviving. Caleb was waiting by the wagon, wearing what passed as his good clothes, clean pants, a shirt without visible mends, a jacket that was only slightly worn. He helped her up without comment, but his hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. They rode toward town in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. As Coldwater came into view, Lydia felt her courage waver. We don't have to stay long, Caleb said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. We make an appearance, show we're not hiding, then leave. All right? And Lydia? He looked at her directly. Whatever they say, whatever they do, you're worth 10 of them. Don't forget that. Before she could respond, they arrived at the town hall where the gathering was being held, and there was no more time for private words. The judgment was about to begin. The town hall blazed with lantern light, warm and inviting against the November cold. Through the windows, Lydia could see people already gathered inside, women in their finest dresses, men in suits they saved for occasions, children racing between tables laden with food. It looked festive, welcoming, like something from a life she'd never been part of. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady under her elbow. She noticed he didn't release her immediately, and when she glanced at him, his jaw was set in that way she'd learned meant he was preparing for battle. Ready? He asked. No, she thought, but she nodded anyway. They walked toward the entrance together, and Lydia felt the weight of attention shift their direction like a physical thing. Conversation stuttered and stopped. Heads turned. The woman in the green traveling suit from the train station, Mrs. Catherine Winters, wife of the bank president, stood near the door with a cluster of other well-dressed women, and her expression of amused disdain was exactly what Lydia had expected.
"Well," Mrs. Winters said, loud enough to carry, "look who decided to grace us with their presence. How generous of the Rourkes to join civilized society." Her companions tittered, the sound like breaking glass. Caleb's hand tightened fractionally on Lydia's elbow, but he kept moving forward, guiding her through the door with deliberate calm.
Inside, the hall was decorated with autumn wreaths and bunting, tables arranged in a large square around a central dance floor. The smell of roasted meat and baked goods filled the air, along with the sound of fiddle music warming up in the corner. Under different circumstances, it might have been pleasant. "Rourke!" a man's voice called out. Mayor Harrison approached, a portly man with white whiskers and an expression of forced joviality. "Good to see you, and this must be your new bride. Welcome to Coldwater, Mrs. Rourke." The title still sounded foreign to Lydia's ears. "Thank you, Mayor. You've certainly made quick work of settling in. I hear from the merchants that you're running quite the efficient household." His smile was professional, political, revealing nothing of what he actually thought. "We're always pleased to welcome new families to our community." "Are we, though, Harrison?" Mrs. Winters had followed them inside, her voice dripping false sweetness. "I think we should be honest about the situation. This isn't exactly a traditional match." "Now, Catherine," the mayor began, but she cut him off. "Oh, I'm not being cruel, simply factual. Mr. Rourke placed an advertisement like one would for livestock, and this woman answered. It's hardly a romance for the ages." Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Caleb spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "Careful, Mrs. Winters. You're talking about my wife. I'm simply stating what everyone's thinking. Surely you can't expect us to pretend this arrangement is normal. I expect you to show basic courtesy, but I suppose that's beyond some people." The tension crackled between them, drawing more attention. Mayor Harrison cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should all just enjoy the evening. There's plenty of food and the dancing will start soon. Dancing! Mrs. Winters laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "Oh, I would pay good money to see that. Though I imagine Mr. Rourke chose a mail-order bride specifically to avoid having to dance with her in public." Several people gasped. Lydia felt the words hit like physical blows, each one finding the soft places she'd tried so hard to armor. Around them, more people had stopped to watch, sensing drama the way vultures sensed death. Caleb turned to face Mrs. Winters fully, and something in his expression made her step back. "You have something to say about my wife. You say it to both of us. But I warn you now, I'm not interested in protecting your feelings when you've shown no interest in protecting hers." "I'm not the one who should be embarrassed," Mrs. Winters said, recovering her composure. "I'm a respectable woman with a proper marriage. I'm not the one who had to be purchased like..." "Like what?" Lydia's voice surprised her with its steadiness. She'd stayed quiet through most of the exchange, falling into old patterns of letting abuse wash over her. But something in Mrs. Winters's smug certainty sparked rage instead of shame. "Say what you mean, Mrs. Winters. Don't hide behind implication." Mrs. Winters's eyes widened slightly, clearly unused to being challenged. "I simply mean that some of us married for love, not desperation." "You married Walter Winters for his bank account," said a dry voice from near the refreshment table. An older woman in a severe black dress stepped forward, her expression sardonic. "Everyone in this room knows it, dear, even if we're too polite to say it. You were 18 and poor, he was 50 and rich, and you've spent the last decade pretending it was a fairy tale." Several people laughed, genuine amusement breaking the tension. Mrs. Winters's face flushed crimson. "Mrs. Thornton, that's completely inappropriate. So is ambushing newcomers at a community gathering," Mrs. Thornton replied coolly. "I'm Adelaide Thornton," she said to Lydia, extending a gnarled hand. "I run the mercantile and I don't tolerate fools. You seem like a sensible woman. Welcome to Coldwater properly this time." Lydia shook her hand, grateful for the unexpected ally. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This town can be cruel when it gets bored." Mrs. Thornton shot a pointed look at Mrs. Winters. "But it can also surprise you. Not everyone here is a viper in silk." Mrs. Winters gathered herself, her mouth tight with fury. "Come, ladies, clearly the company here isn't suitable." She swept away, her followers trailing behind. though Lydia noticed a few of them glanced back with expressions that might have been sympathy. Mayor Harrison coughed awkwardly. "Well, why don't you folks help yourselves to some food? Mrs. Morrison made her famous apple pie, and there's fresh cider." "We're fine, Harrison," Caleb said tersely. He guided Lydia toward a table in the corner, away from the crowd, his hand never leaving her elbow. They sat in tense silence while the party gradually resumed around them. The fiddle music started up again, couples moving onto the dance floor. Lydia watched them spin and turn, their movements easy and familiar, belonging to a world she'd never quite reached. "I'm sorry," Caleb said quietly. "For what?" "For bringing you here. For exposing you to that. You didn't make Mrs. Winters cruel. She accomplished that on her own." Lydia's hands were shaking in her lap. She clasped them together, forcing them still. "Besides, you warned me the town would talk." Talking is one thing. That was something else. That was honest, at least. She said what everyone else was thinking. Caleb turned to look at her directly. "Is that what you believe? That everyone sees you the way she does? Don't they?" Lydia gestured around the room. "Look at them, Caleb. These are people with real marriages, real families. They dance together and laugh together and share lives that actually mean something. What do we have? A business arrangement and separate cabins." "That's not," he started, then stopped, his frustration evident. "It's more complicated than that." "Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, Mrs. Winters was right. You did place an advertisement like you would for livestock. I did answer out of desperation, and we are pretending this is something it's not." "What do you want me to say, Lydia?" "I want you to tell me I'm wrong. I want you to tell me that there's something here worth defending beyond legal papers and property rights. But you can't, can you? Because you've been clear from the beginning that this is all you can offer." The music swelled around them, cheerful and mocking. Caleb's expression was anguished, caught between honesty and something else he couldn't name. "I don't know how to give you what you want," he said finally. "I don't know how to be what you deserve. I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm asking if you feel—" "Mr. and Mrs. Rourke!" Mayor Harrison appeared at their table with forced enthusiasm and another man in tow, tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed. "I wanted to introduce you to Richard Blackwood. He owns several of the larger ranches in the territory, quite influential in local commerce." Blackwood extended his hand to Caleb with a politician's smile. "Rourke, I've heard about your spread north of town. Decent land if you can manage it properly." "I manage fine," Caleb said, his tone flat. "I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Lydia, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. "And this is your wife. How practical of you to find help through correspondence." The insult was subtler than Mrs. Winters, but no less cutting. Lydia felt Caleb tense beside her. "My wife is none of your concern, Blackwood." Of course. I simply meant that it's an unusual arrangement." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "Though I suppose when one's prospects are limited, one must be creative." "Meaning?" "Meaning that a man in your position, struggling ranch, no capital, no connections, has to make compromises. Take what's available rather than what's desirable." He glanced at Lydia again. "No offense intended, Mrs. Rourke." "None taken," Lydia said, her voice ice. "I'm quite familiar with people who measure worth in dollars and appearance. They're usually the ones with nothing else to recommend them." Blackwood's smile tightened. "I see she's got spirit. That's something, at least." Caleb stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud against the floor. "We're leaving. The evening's just started. We're done here." He held out his hand to Lydia. "Come on." But before they could move, Mrs. Winters's voice rang out from across the room, sharp and gleeful. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment." The music stopped. Conversations died. Everyone turned to look at Mrs. Winters, who stood on the raised platform used for announcements, her face flushed with wine and malice. "I think we should properly welcome our newest couple to Coldwater," she said, her words slightly slurred. "After all, it's not every day we witness such a unique union." "Catherine, perhaps you should sit down," Mayor Harrison began, but she waved him off. No, we should celebrate. Mr. Rourke has demonstrated remarkable entrepreneurship in acquiring a wife through mail order. So efficient, So modern. Why waste time on courtship when you can simply purchase companionship? Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Some people looked uncomfortable, but too many looked entertained, hungry for the spectacle. And Mrs. Rourke, such a brave woman, traveling all this way to marry a complete stranger. Though I suppose when one's options are limited, bravery and desperation look rather similar, don't they? Lydia felt the room's attention focus on her like burning glass, concentrating all their judgment into one searing point. This was worse than the train platform, worse than the quiet sneers in the general store. This was public humiliation, carefully orchestrated and gleefully delivered. I propose a toast, Mrs. Winters continued, raising her glass. To the happy couple, may their practical arrangement bring them both exactly what they deserve. A loveless existence in mutual tolerance, two lonely people who settled for less because they couldn't achieve more. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children had stopped moving. Lydia heard someone's sharp intake of breath, felt Caleb's rage radiating like heat beside her. But it was the truth in Mrs. Winters' words that hurt most. The accurate, vicious distillation of exactly what their marriage was. Or what it had been. Lydia stood slowly, drawing every eye in the room. Her legs trembled, but she forced them steady. She'd spent her entire life being mocked, being dismissed, being treated as less than. She'd survived it by staying quiet, by making herself small, by accepting that this was simply how the world worked. But she was done being small. "You're right, Mrs. Winters," she said, her voice carrying clear and strong across the silent room. "This isn't a conventional marriage. I did answer an advertisement. I did travel hundreds of miles to marry a man I'd never met. And I did so because my family made it clear I had no other options." She saw Caleb turn toward her, surprise and something like panic in his expression, but she didn't stop. "You want to know what desperation looks like? It looks like being 26 years old and treated like a burden because you're not pretty enough, not soft enough, not the kind of woman men are supposed to want. It looks like your own mother telling you you should be grateful for any man willing to take you. It looks like having nowhere to go and no one who cares if you disappear." The room remained frozen, but Lydia saw some expression shifting, shame replacing amusement on certain faces, understanding dawning in others. "So yes, I was desperate, and yes, this was a practical arrangement. But you know what I found when I came to this loveless existence?" She looked at Caleb, and her voice softened despite herself. "I found someone who keeps his word. Someone who works until his hands bleed to keep his land running. Someone who defended me against my own brother when he came demanding money. Someone who treats me with more respect in our practical arrangement than most of you treat your own wives in your proper marriages." Mrs. Winters' face had gone pale. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You meant every word. You wanted to humiliate me, to put me in my place, to remind everyone here that I'm less than you, that I'm the woman nobody wanted, married to a man desperate enough to advertise for a wife." Lydia's voice gained strength. "But here's what you don't understand, Mrs. Winters. I don't need to be wanted by everyone. I don't need to be beautiful or graceful or everything you think a woman should be. I just need to matter to one person. To know that in this enormous, cruel world, there's one person who sees me and doesn't look away." She turned to Caleb, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This was the moment. The choice. She could protect herself, maintain the safe distance they'd established, pretend the last months hadn't changed anything, or she could tell the truth and risk everything. "I came here expecting nothing," she said to Caleb directly, the rest of the room fading away. "But you gave me something anyway. You gave me a place where my work matters, where I'm not a burden or an obligation or something to hide. You gave me respect when I'd forgotten what that felt like. And somewhere along the way, you gave me something I'd stopped believing in." "Lydia," his voice was rough, warning and pleading at once. "Hope," she finished. "You gave me hope that maybe I could be more than what everyone else decided I was worth, that maybe this arrangement could become something real." The silence in the hall was deafening. Lydia was dimly aware of people staring, of the scandal this confession would create, but she couldn't stop now. She'd started this, and she would see it through. Caleb stood motionless, his expression torn between a dozen emotions she couldn't read. The moment stretched, agonizing and eternal. Then he moved. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides, and before Lydia could draw breath, he pulled her close. his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted their roughness. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice low but carrying in the absolute silence. "I'll tell you the truth. I placed that advertisement because I was lonely, because I'd convinced myself I could live without connection, without someone to share this life with, because I was a coward who couldn't admit I needed more than just land and work." His thumbs brushed her cheekbones, and Lydia saw tears gathering in his eyes. "When you stepped off that train, I saw exactly what I expected. Someone plain and desperate, someone I could keep at arm's length, someone who wouldn't demand anything I couldn't give." His voice cracked. "But you weren't what I expected. You were stronger, braver. You took my scraps and made something from them. You worked until you couldn't stand and never complained. You looked at this harsh, ugly life and didn't run from it. Caleb, I fell in love with you," he said, and the words hit like thunder. "Somewhere between the fence posts and the morning coffee, between your terrible jokes about the chickens and the way you hum when you think no one's listening, I fell in love with you, and it terrified me because I'd convinced myself I was too broken for that, too damaged, too used to being alone." Lydia's tears came freely now, hot and unstoppable. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't think I deserved you. Because I thought you'd be better off with the arrangement we'd made than with the mess I actually am. Because I'm a fool who spent so long protecting himself that he forgot what it felt like to let someone in." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her face. "But I'm done pretending. I'm done with separate cabins and careful distance and acting like you're just hired help. I love you, Lydia. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to let this world break you. I love you, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." The room erupted. Some people gasped, others murmured in shock. A few actually applauded. But Lydia heard none of it. She heard only Caleb's ragged breathing, felt only his hands trembling against her face, saw only his eyes, those steel-gray eyes that had been so cold when she first arrived, now burning with something that looked remarkably like joy. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to. I tried to be practical, to protect myself. But I love you." He kissed her then, right there in front of everyone. And it was nothing like Lydia had imagined a first kiss would be. It wasn't gentle or practiced or smooth. It was desperate and clumsy and real, tasting of salt from their tears and months of longing they'd both tried to deny. When they finally broke apart, the room had descended into chaos. Some people were crying. Mrs. Thornton was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Others were arguing in fierce whispers. Mrs. Winters looked like she'd swallowed something poisonous, her face a mixture of rage and humiliation. But Blackwood's expression was the most concerning. His jaw was tight, his eyes calculating, and when he caught Caleb looking at him, something cold and vindictive passed across his features. "How touching," Blackwood said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Truly, a performance worthy of the stage. But I wonder, Rourke, if you've considered the consequences of this little declaration." Caleb kept his arm around Lydia, pulling her close. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the loan your ranch is built on. The one held by Winters Bank, where I happen to be a majority investor." Blackwood's smile was sharp as a knife. "I'm talking about your reputation in this community, which, as of tonight, has become quite complicated." Mayor Harrison pushed forward, his face anxious. "Now, Richard, there's no need to bring business into this. On the contrary, Harrison, business is exactly what this is." Blackwood addressed the room at large, his voice carrying the weight of money and influence. "Coldwater is a respectable town. We have standards, expectations. We can't have people making spectacles of themselves, airing personal matters in public gatherings. It reflects poorly on all of us." "We didn't make a spectacle," Lydia said firmly. "Mrs. Winters did that when she decided to humiliate us for entertainment." "I was simply speaking the truth," Mrs. Winters began, but her husband, a portly man who'd been silent until now, cut her off. "Catherine, that's enough. You've caused sufficient trouble for one evening." His wife gaped at him. "Walter, you can't possibly." "I said enough." Walter Winters' voice held unexpected steel. He looked at Caleb and Lydia with something like apology. "My wife sometimes forgets that cruelty disguised as honesty is still cruelty. I apologize for her behavior." Blackwood's expression darkened. "Winters, are you actually defending this circus?" I'm defending common decency, Walter replied, something my wife seems to have misplaced this evening.
The room was dividing, Lydia realized. Some people were clearly on Blackwood's side, the wealthy, the influential, those who valued respectability above all else. But others were shifting, uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. Mrs. Thornton stood with her arms crossed, glaring at anyone who met her eyes. Several younger couples whispered among themselves, their expressions sympathetic. Even Mayor Harrison looked torn, caught between powerful interests and basic fairness. "This isn't over, Rourke," Blackwood said softly, dangerously. "You've made your choice tonight. Now you'll live with the consequences." He strode out of the hall, several of the wealthier ranchers following him. Mrs. Winters started to leave as well, but her husband caught her arm, holding her in place with a grip that suggested they'd be having words later.
The party resumed awkwardly, people returning to their conversations in subdued tones. The fiddle started up again, but no one danced. Lydia felt exhausted, emotionally wrung out, but also lighter than she'd been in months, maybe years. Caleb guided her toward the door, nodding briefly to Mrs. Thornton as they passed. "You've got courage, girl," the old woman said. "Both of you do. Don't let the bastards grind you down." "We won't," Caleb replied. Outside, the night air was cold and clean, washing away the stuffiness of the hall. They walked to the wagon in silence, and Caleb helped her up before climbing up beside her. "That was reckless," he said finally, snapping the reins. "I know. Blackwood's dangerous. He's got influence, money, connections. He could make things very difficult for us. I know. We might lose the ranch. Everything I've worked for could disappear because I couldn't keep my mouth shut for one more evening." Lydia looked at him in the moonlight, at the strong line of his jaw and the worry etched in his features. "Do you regret it?" He was quiet for a long moment, the horse's hooves providing rhythm to the silence. Then he reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Not for a second." They rode home under a sky full of stars, their hands joined, their future uncertain, but finally, truly, theirs. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The first letter arrived 3 days after the harvest gathering, delivered by a tight-lipped clerk from Winter's Bank who wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. Lydia watched from the kitchen window as her husband opened it on the porch, saw his shoulders stiffen, his jaw clench. When he came inside, his face was carved from stone. "What is it?" she asked, though dread already pooled in her stomach. "Notice of loan review." He tossed the paper onto the table. "Blackwood's calling in favors. They want full documentation of ranch income, expenses, assets. They're looking for reasons to call the loan due." Lydia picked up the letter, scanning the formal language that barely disguised its threat. "Can they do that? If they find me in violation of terms, yes. And terms can be interpreted broadly when the bank wants them to be." Caleb poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. "I've been making payments on time, but the ranch doesn't turn much profit. Most of what we earn goes back into operations. On paper, I probably look like a bad risk. How long do we have? They want everything submitted within 2 weeks, then they'll make their determination." He laughed, bitter and harsh. "Determination. That's a polite word for deciding whether to destroy us." Lydia set down the letter and moved to stand beside him. "Then we give them what they want. We document everything, show them the ranch is viable, prove you're not a risk." "Lydia, you don't understand. This isn't about actual risk. This is about punishment. Blackwood doesn't like being embarrassed, and we embarrassed him in front of the whole town." Caleb's voice was rough with frustration. "He's got enough influence to make the numbers say whatever he wants them to say." "So what are you suggesting? That we just give up?" "I'm suggesting that I've dragged you into something that might cost us everything. The ranch, our home, our future." He finally looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes cut deeper than any of Blackwood's threats. "I should have kept quiet at that gathering. Should have let Mrs. Winters have her fun and walked away. Instead, I made a grand declaration, and now we'll both pay for my pride." "Stop." Lydia's voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiral. "Stop talking like loving me is a mistake you need to apologize for. You think I regret what happened? You think I'd trade that moment, finally being chosen, finally mattering to someone, for the safety of silence? You might when we're homeless. Then we'll be homeless together, but we won't go down without fighting." She grabbed his hands, forcing him to feel her certainty. You've spent 5 years building this ranch from nothing. You've survived droughts and harsh winters and loneliness that would have broken most men. You think I'm going to let Richard Blackwood take that away because he got his feelings hurt? Something flickered in Caleb's expression. Not quite hope, but not complete defeat either. What do you suggest? We start by doing exactly what they asked. Document everything, but we also find allies. Mrs. Thornton stood up for us. Walter Winters apologized for his wife. There were others at that gathering who didn't side with Blackwood. We're not as alone as he wants us to believe. Lydia, ki'i.
No, listen to me. She squeezed his hands tighter. You told me once that I don't have to be wanted by everyone. I just need to matter to one person. Well, that works both ways. I don't need the whole town on our side. I just need enough people willing to stand with us when it counts. Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her with desperate strength. When did you get so fierce? I was always fierce. I just didn't have anything worth fighting for. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of wool and wood smoke and him. Now I do. They spent that evening going through Caleb's records, such as they were. 5 years of receipts stuffed in boxes, accounts scribbled in ledgers with Caleb's uncertain handwriting, bills of sale and purchase orders mixed together without organization. Lydia spread it all across the kitchen table and began the tedious work of making sense of chaos. You've been tracking this? She asked, holding up a page of numbers that seemed to represent livestock sales. After a fashion, I'm not good with letters and numbers, never had much schooling. That's why you always ask me to read the supply lists. It wasn't a question. She'd noticed his hesitation around written words, the way he'd memorize rather than read. Why didn't you tell me? Shame, I suppose. Seemed like one more thing I was failing at. He sat across from her, looking older in the lamplight. My uncle didn't believe in education. Said work was all a man needed. By the time I left, I'd missed too much to catch up. Lydia's heart ached for the boy he'd been, denied even basic tools to navigate the world. I could teach you if you wanted. At my age? Reading doesn't have an age limit, neither does learning. She pulled one of the ledgers closer. Besides, if we're going to save this ranch, we need to present these numbers properly. That means organizing them into something the bank can't twist against us. They worked late into the night, Lydia creating order from disorder while Caleb filled in gaps from memory. The picture that emerged was better than he'd thought. The ranch had actually turned modest profits 3 of the last 5 years, enough to cover the loan payments with some left over for improvements. The problem was that everything was reinvested immediately, making it look like they were barely surviving when in truth they were building equity. This is good, Lydia said as the clock struck midnight. This shows growth, sustainability. You've increased your herd by 40%, improved the land, added infrastructure. On paper, this is exactly what a bank should want to see. On paper isn't reality, not when Blackwood's already decided how this ends. Then we change his mind, or we go over his head. Caleb looked at her with weary affection. You don't give up, do you? Not when the stakes are this high. The second letter came a week later, this one from Mayor Harrison requesting a meeting. Caleb went into town alone, over Lydia's protests, and returned hours later with news that was somehow worse than she'd feared. Blackwood's been busy, he said, slumping into a chair. He's convinced half the town council that we're a disruptive influence, morally questionable, bad for Coldwater's reputation. Based on what? Loving each other? Based on the spectacle at the harvest gathering, the public display, the unconventional nature of our marriage. Caleb's voice was flat, defeated. He's framing it as a question of community standards. Says if we allow this kind of behavior, what's next? Where do we draw the line? That's absurd. We didn't do anything wrong. We challenged the social order, made people uncomfortable, forced them to question their own arrangements. He rubbed his face tiredly. Harrison's sympathetic, but he's also political. He won't take a stand that costs him support. So he'll sacrifice us to keep the peace. Essentially, yes. Lydia felt rage building, hot and righteous. And the loan review? Still proceeding. Harrison said the bank's within their rights to ensure borrowers are financially stable. He can't interfere with legitimate business practices. Caleb's laugh was hollow. Legitimate. As if any of this is about legitimate concerns. What did Harrison suggest we do? Apologize, publicly.
Admit we were inappropriate. Promise to conduct ourselves more decorously in the future. Caleb met her eyes, and she saw the answer there before he spoke. He suggested you might be more comfortable in town, living separately until things settle down. The air left Lydia's lungs. He wants us to go back to the arrangement we had, pretend nothing changed. He wants the appearance of propriety, the illusion that we've learned our lesson and returned to acceptable boundaries. No. The word came out harder than she intended. No, we're not doing that. Lydia, if we don't, what? They take the ranch? Fine, let them take it, but I will not stand in front of that town and apologize for loving you. I will not pretend that what we have is shameful or wrong or something that needs to be hidden. Her voice shook with fury. I spent 26 years making myself smaller, quieter, less than I was, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for me. I'm done shrinking. Caleb stood and pulled her into his arms, and she felt him trembling. I can't ask you to give up everything for pride. It's not pride, it's dignity. It's refusing to let them dictate who we're allowed to be. She pulled back to look at him. You told me once that you stopped caring what this town thinks. Did you mean it? Yes. Then prove it. Stand with me, even if it costs us the ranch. He searched her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, we do this together, whatever comes. The third letter arrived the following morning, hand-delivered by Walter Winters himself. He stood on the porch looking uncomfortable, his hat crushed in his hands. Mrs. Rourke, Mr. Rourke, I hope I'm not intruding. Mr. Winters. Caleb's voice was wary. This is unexpected. I imagine it is, given circumstances. Walter shifted his weight. May I come in? What I have to say shouldn't be discussed on the porch. They led him into the kitchen, where Lydia poured coffee nobody wanted. Walter sat heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60-some years. I'm here in an unofficial capacity, he began. What I tell you doesn't leave this room. All right, Caleb said slowly. Blackwood's pushing hard to call your loan. He's got support from some of the wealthier ranchers who see you as competition, or who simply don't like boats being rocked. Walter sipped his coffee, grimacing. But he doesn't have unanimous support. There are those of us who think this has gone too far. Lydia leaned forward. Us? Myself? Adelaide Thornton? A few others? We've watched Blackwood bully this town for years, using his money and influence to bend things his way. Most times we go along because it's easier, but this, he gestured vaguely. This feels different, more personal, more cruel. Why are you telling us this? Caleb asked. Because you should know you're not without friends, even if we haven't been brave enough to say so publicly. Walter pulled a folded paper from his jacket. This is the bank's internal assessment of your loan. I'm not supposed to have it, and you definitely didn't get it from me. Caleb unfolded the paper, scanning the contents with Lydia reading over his shoulder. The assessment was surprisingly positive. The ranch was deemed viable, the loan secure, the risk minimal. At the bottom, in a different hand, was a note. Despite financial soundness, recommend calling loan due to borrower's questionable character and potential negative impact on bank's reputation. Blackwood added that last part, Walter said. The actual financial analyst said you're fine, but he's overruling them based on moral grounds. Can he do that? Lydia asked. He's the majority investor. He can do whatever he wants, practically speaking. Walter finished his coffee. But he needs the town council to back his play, to make it look legitimate rather than vindictive. That's where the fight is. And you think we can win that fight? I think you have a chance, a small one, but a chance nonetheless. Walter stood, retrieving his hat. There's a council meeting in 3 days, public comment period. If you can make your case there, if enough people speak up, Harrison might find the courage to stand against Blackwood. Might, Caleb repeated. That's not much to bet everything on. It's what you've got. Walter moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About my wife, about how you've been treated. Catherine's always been cruel to those she sees as beneath her, but I've enabled it by staying silent. That ends now. After he left, Lydia and Caleb sat in stunned silence, processing this unexpected development. Do you trust him? Lydia asked finally. I don't know. Could it be a trap, trying to get us to make fools of ourselves at the council meeting? Or it could be genuine, a real chance to fight back. Caleb studied the assessment paper. Even if it's genuine, it's a long shot.
We'd be going up against the most powerful man in the territory, in a public forum where he controls half the voices. So we control the other half. Lydia stood decisively. Mrs. Thornton's on our side, Walter Winters is on our side. There were others at that gathering who looked sympathetic. We spend the next 3 days finding them, building support, making sure our story gets heard. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's necessary. She held out her hand. Come on. We have work to do. They spent the next 72 hours in a whirlwind of activity. Lydia visited Mrs. Thornton at the Mercantile, who proved to be a formidable ally with strong opinions and extensive connections. Together they identified families who'd shown sympathy or who had their own grievances with Blackwood's heavy-handed control of the town. Caleb spoke to neighboring ranchers, finding surprising support among those who felt threatened by Blackwood's expanding influence. Not everyone was receptive. Some shut doors in their faces, unwilling to risk Blackwood's displeasure. Others listened politely but made no commitments. But enough people agreed to attend the council meeting to consider speaking up that something like hope began to build. The morning of the meeting, Lydia stood before the small mirror in what was now their shared bedroom. She'd moved out of the cabin the day after the harvest gathering and tried to calm her racing heart. She'd chosen her best dress, pinned her hair carefully, but she still saw the same plain face, the same sturdy body that had always invited dismissal. "You're beautiful," Caleb said from the doorway. "I'm practical at best. You're beautiful to me. That's what matters." He crossed to stand behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "You ready for this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The town hall was packed when they arrived, standing room only. Blackwood sat at the front with the other council members, his expression confident and controlled. Mrs. Winters was there, looking subdued beside her husband. Mayor Harrison shuffled papers nervously. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Harrison called the meeting to order, droning through standard business while Lydia's anxiety climbed higher. Finally, he reached the loan review. "We have before us a petition from Mr. Richard Blackwood regarding the Rourke Ranch loan held by Winters Bank," Harrison read. "Mr. Blackwood has raised concerns about the borrower's character and standing in the community. The council will hear arguments before making a recommendation." Blackwood stood, smooth and authoritative. "Gentlemen, ladies, this is a simple matter of community standards. Coldwater has always prided itself on being a respectable town. We have expectations of behavior, of propriety, of how people conduct themselves in public." He gestured toward Caleb and Lydia. Mr. and Mrs. Rourke violated those standards at the harvest gathering. They created a spectacle, forced their private affairs into public view, and demonstrated a concerning lack of judgment. Now, I'm not saying they're bad people. I'm saying they've shown themselves to be unreliable, impulsive, and potentially damaging to our community's reputation. "That's a lie," someone called out. Lydia turned to see one of the younger ranchers standing. "They didn't create that spectacle. Mrs. Winters did when she decided to publicly humiliate them." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Regardless of who initiated the situation, the Rourke's response was inappropriate, and they defended themselves, Mrs. Thornton interrupted, rising from her seat like an avenging angel. "Something more people in this town should learn to do. You want to talk about character, Blackwood? Let's talk about using financial pressure to punish people who embarrass you. Let's talk about turning a business decision into a personal vendetta. This is about protecting the bank's interests. This is about protecting your ego," Walter Winters said, standing beside his wife, who looked like she wanted to disappear. "I've seen the financial assessment. The Rourke loan is sound. This action is purely retaliatory, and I won't be party to it." The room erupted in conversation, people taking sides, arguing across the aisles. Harrison banged his gavel futilely. "Order! We need order!" Caleb stood, and something in his bearing made the room gradually quiet. "May I speak?" Harrison hesitated, then nodded. "The floor recognizes Mr. Rourke." Caleb moved to the front, and Lydia saw his hands trembling slightly. Public speaking terrified him. He'd admitted as much during their preparation, but he stood straight, his voice carrying clear and strong. "I'm not an educated man. I can barely read, and I'm not good with fancy words. But I know right from wrong, and what's happening here is wrong." He looked directly at Blackwood. "You want to take my ranch because I embarrassed you, not because I can't pay my debts, not because I'm a risk to the bank.
but because I chose my wife over your approval. That's not, Blackwood began, but Caleb continued. I've worked that land for 5 years, broke my back turning scrub into something productive, built everything with my own hands, paid every debt on time, asked nothing from this town except to be left alone. His voice grew stronger. Then I met Lydia, and she showed me that being alone wasn't the same as being strong, that asking for help wasn't weakness, that loving someone was worth more than protecting yourself. He turned to address the room at large. Maybe we did make a spectacle. Maybe we should have been quieter, more private, more appropriate. But you know what? I'm not sorry. For the first time in my life, I chose something that mattered over something that was easy. I chose love over loneliness. And if that makes me unsuitable for your community, then your community's standards need examining, not my character. Applause broke out from several corners. Blackwood's face darkened. Touching speech, Rourke, but the fact remains that you're a bully, Lydia said, rising to stand beside Caleb. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words came anyway. You use your money and power to control people, to punish anyone who doesn't fit your vision of how things should be. Well, I don't fit. I never have. I'm plain and strong and too direct, and no amount of pretending will change that. She looked around the room, meeting eyes that had judged her, dismissed her, mocked her. But I'm also honest. I work hard. I keep my word. And I love my husband with everything I have. If that's not enough for Coldwater, then Coldwater can go to hell. Gasps and shocked laughter. Harrison's gavel banged again, but Lydia wasn't finished. You want to take our ranch? Fine. Do it. But you'll have to live with knowing you destroyed 2 people who were trying to build something real, something good, just because they didn't perform propriety the way you demanded. You'll have to live with being exactly the kind of people who drive out anyone who challenges your comfortable lies about what makes a good marriage or a respectable life. She grabbed Caleb's hand. We're done justifying ourselves to you. Done begging for acceptance. We came here tonight because Walter Winters said we had a chance, that some of you might have the courage to stand up to Blackwood. But if you don't, if you let him do this, then you're all complicit. Every one of you who stays silent is telling him that fear matters more than fairness. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, Walter Winters stood. I vote against calling the loan. The Rourkes have done nothing wrong except refuse to be ashamed. Mrs. Thornton stood. I second that. And I'll say this. Anyone who votes with Blackwood can find somewhere else to buy their supplies. I won't take money from cowards. One by one, others stood. The younger rancher, a merchant Lydia had never met, a woman with 3 children who'd smiled at her in the general store. Not everyone. Many remained seated, unwilling to take sides. But enough stood that Blackwood's certainty began to crack. Harrison counted quickly. That's a majority against the petition. The council cannot recommend calling the loan. Blackwood's face went purple with rage. This is ridiculous. Harrison, you can't. I can, and I am. The council has spoken. Harrison actually smiled, small and nervous but genuine. The Rourke loan will continue under its current terms. Meeting adjourned. The gavel fell, final and decisive. Chaos erupted, some people cheering, others arguing, Blackwood shouting threats that no one was listening to anymore. Lydia felt Caleb's arms around her, felt tears streaming down her face, heard him laughing and crying at the same time. We did it, he whispered into her hair. We actually did it. We did it together. They stayed locked together while the room swirled around them, the center of calm in a storm of reaction. Mrs. Thornton appeared, gripping both their shoulders with surprising strength. That was well done, both of you, she sniffed. Now get out of here before Blackwood recovers enough to cause more trouble. They left through this back door, avoiding the worst of the crowd, and walked to their wagon in the gathering twilight. The November air was cold and clean, and Lydia breathed it in like salvation. What happens now? She asked as Caleb helped her up. Now we go home. We work the ranch. We build our life. He climbed up beside her, taking her hand. And we stop caring what anyone else thinks about it. As they drove out of town, Lydia looked back at the hall, still lit and noisy with debate. They'd won. Against the odds, against the power structures, against everything that said people like them should stay quiet and grateful for scraps, they'd won. But she knew this wasn't the end. Blackwood wouldn't forgive this defeat. The town would still gossip. There would be consequences they couldn't foresee. The difference was, now they'd face those consequences together, without apology, without shame. The retaliation began before they'd even made it home that night. As the wagon crested the ridge overlooking their property, Caleb pulled the horses to an abrupt stop, his body going rigid beside Lydia. "What's wrong?" she asked, then saw what had frozen him. Smoke. Dark columns rising from multiple points on their land, visible even in the dying light. Caleb snapped the reins hard, sending the horses into a gallop that had Lydia gripping the seat. Her heart hammered against her ribs as they tore down the slope, the smell of burning growing stronger with each passing second. Please, she thought desperately, please don't let it be the house. It wasn't the house. It was worse. The northern pasture fence was ablaze, flames eating through the wooden posts they'd replaced together weeks ago. Beyond it, she could see cattle scattered and panicked, some already having broken through to dangerous terrain. The barn doors stood open, and inside hay bales smoldered, not fully burning yet, but close enough that the horses inside were screaming with terror. Caleb was off the wagon before it fully stopped, running toward the barn. "Get water," he shouted, "as much as you can carry." Lydia jumped down and sprinted to the well, her mind cataloging the disaster even as her body moved. The fence fires were too widespread to fight. They'd have to let those burn out. But the barn could be saved if they moved fast enough. She hauled up bucket after bucket, her arms screaming, her dress soaked and heavy. Caleb emerged from the barn leading two terrified horses, their eyes white-rimmed with panic. He got them to the corral and ran back in for more. Lydia met him at the entrance with the first bucket of water, and he threw it on the smoldering hay with desperate efficiency. "There's more in the back," he coughed, smoke already affecting his voice. "If it reaches the hayloft, we lose everything." They worked in frantic synchronization, Lydia hauling water while Caleb fought the flames inside. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but they couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. This was their life burning, their future, everything they'd fought for. It took an hour to get the barn fire under control. By then, the fence fires had mostly burned themselves out, leaving scorched earth and destroyed posts. Caleb stood in the barn doorway, covered in soot and ash, breathing hard. His hands were blistered from beating out flames, and when he wiped his face, it came away black. "The cattle," he said hoarsely. "We need to round them up before we lose them in the dark." "Caleb, you can barely stand." "I can stand well enough." He moved toward the horses they'd saved, determination overriding exhaustion. "We don't have time to rest, not tonight." They spent the next 3 hours in darkness, finding and herding panicked cattle back to what remained of safe pasture. Some had fled too far to find. Others had injured themselves on rocks or broken through into the Morrison property. By the time they finished what they could, it was past midnight, and Lydia could barely feel her legs. Inside the house, she lit lamps with shaking hands while Caleb collapsed into a chair. Neither spoke for a long moment, the silence heavy with the weight of what they both knew. "Blackwood," Lydia finally said, "can't prove it." "We don't need proof. We know." Caleb's laugh was bitter and exhausted. Knowing and proving are different things, and even if we could prove it, who would we tell? Harrison, the counsel that barely found the courage to stand up to him once? He dropped his head into his hands. "We won the battle tonight. This is him showing us we haven't won the war." Lydia wanted to argue, to insist they'd find a way to fight back. But looking at the ruin outside, at her husband's defeated posture, the words wouldn't come. Blackwood had made his point devastatingly clear. Legal victories meant nothing if he could destroy them through other means. She moved behind Caleb, gently removing his ruined shirt to assess the burns on his shoulders and arms. They weren't severe, but they needed tending. As she cleaned and bandaged them, she felt him trembling, not from pain, but from the effort of holding himself together. "We'll rebuild the fences," she said quietly. "Round up the rest of the cattle tomorrow. Check the damage in daylight and make a plan." "With what money, Lydia? The lumber for those fences took most of our reserve. We've got loan payments coming due, and now we've lost livestock, feed, infrastructure." His voice cracked. "Maybe we should have just apologized, played their game, kept our heads down." "No." She moved to face him, forcing him to look at her. "Don't you dare regret standing up for us. Don't you dare wish we'd stayed silent." "I'm not wishing that. I'm wishing I hadn't dragged you into this mess. You could have—" "I could have what?"
Stayed with my family who treated me like garbage, answered someone else's advertisement, and ended up in a different kind of prison. She gripped his face in both hands. I'm exactly where I chose to be. With you. Fighting for something that matters. That hasn't changed just because Blackwood decided to throw a tantrum.
He pulled her close, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. They stayed that way for a long time, drawing strength from each other while the lamp burned low. The knock on the door came at dawn. Lydia answered to find Walter Winters on the porch, his face grim. I heard about the fires, he said without preamble. The whole town's heard. Blackwood's people are calling it an accident. Unfortunate timing. It was arson, Caleb said from behind Lydia. We both know it. I know it. Proving it's another matter. Walter shifted uncomfortably. I came to tell you that Blackwood's not done. He's already working on his next move, trying to get the territorial governor involved, claiming Coldwater's descending into lawlessness because the council won't maintain standards. Lydia felt ice in her veins. The governor could override the council's decision. He could. Probably won't. It's too small a matter for his attention. But Blackwood's also buying up land around your property. Morrison sold him his ranch last night. Others are considering offers. Walter met Caleb's eyes. He's trying to surround you, cut off your access to shared grazing rights, water sources. Make it impossible to operate even if you keep the land. How long do we have? Morrison's sale finalizes in 30 days, but Blackwood's making offers to 3 other neighbors right now. Walter pulled an envelope from his coat. This is from Adelaide Thornton. She wanted you to have it before anyone else saw. Caleb opened it, and Lydia read over his shoulder. Inside was a bank draft for $200 and a note in Mrs. Thornton's angular handwriting. For fence repairs and whatever else you need. Pay me back when you can, or don't. Some fights are worth funding. Give them hell. 8. Lydia's throat tightened. Why would she do this? Because she's been watching Blackwood bully this town for 20 years, and she's tired of it, Walter said. She's not the only one. There are others willing to help, but they're afraid. Blackwood controls too much. The bank, the largest ranches, the supply contracts. Cross him openly, and you risk your livelihood. So what do you suggest we do? Caleb's voice was flat. Keep fighting a man who can destroy us without breaking a sweat? I suggest you stop fighting alone. Walter straightened. Blackwood's power comes from people's fear and isolation. Everyone thinks they're the only one who resents him, so nobody bands together. But what if they did? What if you gave them a reason to stand united? How? A town meeting, not the council, an actual community gathering. Present your case not just about the loan, but about everything. Blackwood's land grabs, his intimidation tactics, the way he's been consolidating control. Make it about more than just you and Lydia. Make it about the kind of town Coldwater wants to be. Lydia saw the logic immediately. If people understand they're all targets, not just us, then they might find the courage to push back, Walter finished. It's risky, could backfire spectacularly, but it's better than slowly dying while Blackwood picks you apart piece by piece. Caleb looked at Lydia, a question in his eyes. She nodded. All right, Caleb said. Tell us what we need to do. The next week was a blur of preparation. While Caleb and hired hands, paid with Mrs. Thornton's money, worked to rebuild fences and recover livestock, Lydia coordinated with their growing network of allies. Walter Winters used his bank connections to document Blackwood's land acquisitions and financial manipulations. Mrs. Thornton gathered testimonies from merchants and small ranchers who'd been squeezed by Blackwood's practices. Others contributed stories of intimidation, unfair contracts, and abuse of power. The picture that emerged was damning. For years, Blackwood had been systematically consolidating control of Coldwater, using his wealth to buy up struggling properties, his influence to steer contracts to his allies, and his position at the bank to deny loans to potential competitors. The Rourkes weren't an aberration. They were just the first to fight back publicly. This is substantial, Mayor Harrison said when they presented him with their findings. They'd met in his office, away from prying eyes, and he looked genuinely troubled. If even half of this is accurate, it's all accurate, Mrs. Thornton interrupted. I've got signed statements, financial records, contracts that show systematic abuse. Blackwood's been building an empire on the backs of people too scared to oppose him. Why hasn't anyone brought this forward before? Because you haven't wanted to see it, Harrison, Walter said bluntly. Blackwood makes life easy for those who cooperate. You get favorable treatment, access to his resources, protection from his wrath. It's easier to look away than to risk losing that. Harrison flushed but didn't argue. What are you asking from me? Sanction an official town meeting, Lydia said. Let us present this information publicly. Let people speak. Let the community decide what kind of town they want to be. Blackwood will fight this. Let him fight. Let everyone see what he's willing to do to maintain control. Caleb leaned forward. You told us to apologize, to fall in line. We chose not to. Now we're asking you to make the same choice. Fall in line or stand up. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his political instincts warring with whatever conscience he possessed. Finally, he sighed. I'll authorize the meeting 2 weeks from today in the town hall, but I can't protect you from the consequences. We're not asking for protection, Lydia said, just a fair chance to be heard. Word of the meeting spread quickly, and the town's reaction was explosive. Blackwood's supporters called it a witch hunt, a personal vendetta disguised as public concern. His opponents, growing bolder now that they weren't alone, welcomed it as overdue reckoning. The tension in Coldwater grew palpable, every interaction charged with the weight of choosing sides. 3 days before the meeting, Lydia was in town picking up supplies when she encountered Mrs. Catherine Winters outside the general store. The woman who'd orchestrated her public humiliation stood frozen on the sidewalk, clearly debating whether to flee or engage. Mrs. Rourke, she said finally, her voice lacking its usual confidence. Mrs. Winters. An awkward silence stretched between them. Then, surprising them both, Catherine spoke. I owe you an apology. For the harvest gathering, for my cruelty, for... She gestured vaguely. Everything. Lydia studied her carefully, searching for mockery or manipulation. She found only genuine discomfort. What changed? My husband. After that night, he made it clear that my behavior was unacceptable, that he'd enabled it for too long. Catherine looked down at her gloved hands. And then the fires happened, and I realized I helped create the climate that made Blackwood think he could do that. My cruelty contributed to your suffering. So this is guilt. Yes. And shame. And recognition that I've been exactly the kind of person I was raised not to be. Catherine met her eyes. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that not everyone who stood silent approves of what's happening. Then don't stand silent, Lydia said. Come to the meeting. Speak up. It's not too late to choose differently. Catherine nodded slowly. I'll think about it. 2 days before the meeting, Morrison, who'd sold his ranch to Blackwood, appeared at the Rourke property looking haggard and desperate. I made a mistake, he said without preamble. Selling to Blackwood. He's already changed everything, brought in his own people, cut off the water access I'd been sharing with you and the other neighbors. Why are you telling us this? Caleb asked warily. Because the contract had clauses I didn't notice. He's not just taking my ranch, he's taking my reputation, making it look like I mismanaged things, drove them into the ground. He's destroying me even after I gave him what he wanted. Morrison's voice shook. I came to warn you. He won't stop with land. He'll take everything. Your name, your history, your standing. He needs people broken, not just defeated. After Morrison left, Lydia found Caleb staring out at the rebuilt fences, his expression troubled. You're worried, she said, coming to stand beside him. I'm terrified. What if this meeting changes nothing? What if people choose comfort over courage and we end up worse off than before? Then we'll survive it, like we've survived everything else. She took his hand. But you know what I think? I think we're not the only ones tired of being afraid. I think Morrison's regret is shared by others who've cooperated with Blackwood. I think people are ready for something different. They just need someone to show them it's possible. That's a lot of hope riding on two people who can barely read and write between them. Good thing we've got friends who can. The night before the meeting, their allies gathered at the ranch. Walter and Catherine Winters, Mrs. Thornton, several younger ranchers and merchants, even Mayor Harrison looking nervous but committed. They reviewed their presentation, assigned speaking roles, prepared for every argument Blackwood might make. He'll try to make this about personal grievances, Walter warned. He'll frame you as malcontents attacking a pillar of the community. Then we show it's not personal, it's systemic, Mrs. Thornton countered. We show the pattern of behavior, the documented abuses, The testimonies from multiple sources. Catherine spoke up quietly. He'll also attack your marriage again, paint you as morally questionable people whose word can't be trusted. Let him try, Lydia said. We're not ashamed of loving each other. We're not hiding anymore. As the group dispersed into the cold November night, Caleb pulled Lydia aside.
Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know you've changed my life. Not just by being here, but by showing me what courage looks like. How to stand up instead of just surviving. You taught me the same thing, Lydia said. I came here thinking I was broken, that the best I could hope for was to be useful to someone. You showed me I could be more, that I could matter. They held each other in the darkness, drawing strength for the battle ahead. The town hall was packed beyond capacity when they arrived the next morning. Every seat filled, people standing along the walls, more gathered outside, unable to fit inside. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation and anxiety. Blackwood sat in the front row, flanked by his lawyers and his most loyal supporters. He looked confident, almost amused, clearly expecting this meeting to reinforce his control rather than challenge it. Mayor Harrison calls the meeting to order, his voice shaking slightly. We're gathered today to address concerns about land use, business practices, and community governance. Multiple parties have requested the opportunity to speak. We'll hear from everyone in turn, then open the floor to discussion. Walter Winters went first, presenting the financial documentation with banker's precision. He showed how Blackwood had systematically acquired property through a combination of aggressive offers and strategic denial of credit to competitors. How he'd created monopolies in key industries, forcing suppliers to choose between his contracts or survival. Mrs. Thornton followed, reading testimony after testimony from people who'd been intimidated, threatened, or economically punished for crossing Blackwood. Store owners denied wholesale access, ranchers frozen out of markets, families forced to sell at unfair prices or lose everything. Then Morrison stood, his shame evident but his voice steady. I sold my ranch because I was afraid of being targeted like the Rourkes were, afraid of losing everything if I didn't cooperate. But cooperating didn't save me, it just changed how I was destroyed. Blackwood doesn't want partners or neighbors, he wants subjects. Caleb spoke next, describing the fires, the sabotage, the systematic campaign to drive them out after they'd refused to apologize for their love. His plain language and obvious sincerity were more powerful than any eloquent speech. I'm not educated, he said. I don't know fancy words or legal terms, but I know right from wrong. And what's happening in this town is wrong. One man shouldn't have the power to destroy lives just because people won't bow to him. Finally, Lydia stood. She'd prepared a speech, practiced it carefully, but standing before the assembled town, she abandoned the script and spoke from her heart. When I came to Coldwater, I was nobody. A plain woman from a family that didn't want her, answering an advertisement from a desperate man. Every person in this room probably looked at me and thought I deserved whatever I got. She saw heads drop, confirming the truth. And maybe I did deserve it. Maybe we all get exactly what our courage earns us. She walked to stand beside Caleb. But somewhere between that train platform and today, I learned something. Being nobody means you have nothing to lose. And people with nothing to lose are the most dangerous people in the world because they can tell the truth without fear. So here's the truth. Richard Blackwood is terrified of you. All of you. He's terrified that if you band together, if you stop being afraid, you'll realize he's just one man with money. That his power only exists because you give it to him. That the moment you decide his approval isn't worth your freedom, he becomes irrelevant. She turned to look directly at Blackwood. You can take our ranch. You can take our livelihood. You can probably even drive us out of Coldwater if you work hard enough. But you can't take what matters most, the fact that we chose each other over your approval, that we'd rather lose everything than live in fear of you. The hall erupted in response. Some shouting agreement, others protesting, the noise building until Harrison's gavel could barely be heard. Order! We need order, Harrison shouted. Mr. Blackwood, you have the right to respond. Blackwood stood slowly, his confidence finally showing cracks. This is nothing but slander from people with personal axes to grind. Every business decision I've made has been legal, documented, and in the best interests of Coldwater's growth. At whose expense? Someone shouted from the crowd. Yeah, how many families have you driven out to make room for your growth? Another voice called. Blackwood's face reddened. I will not be interrogated by a mob. These accusations are baseless. Are they?
Walter held up a thick folder. Because I have documentation here of every property you've acquired in the last 5 years. Every loan denied to potential competitors. Every contract steered to your allies. It's all legal, technically, but legality and morality aren't the same thing. The crowd's murmur grew louder. People were connecting dots, seeing patterns they'd ignored before. Blackwood looked around at faces that were no longer friendly, no longer cowed, and something like panic flickered in his eyes. This is absurd. Harrison, I demand you end this circus immediately. I'm sorry, Richard, but they have the floor. Harrison's voice was stronger now, fed by the crowd's energy. And frankly, I think the town deserves answers. Answers? You want answers? Blackwood's composure shattered completely. Fine. Yes, I've built an empire here. Yes, I've acquired property and eliminated competition. That's called business. That's called success. None of you had the vision or the courage to do what I did, and now you resent me for it. We don't resent your success, Mrs. Thornton said coldly. We resent your cruelty. There's a difference between building something and destroying everyone in your path. Catherine Winters stood, her voice trembling, but clear. I've enabled that cruelty. I've mocked people to make myself feel superior, echoed Richard's contempt for anyone who didn't meet his standards. I'm ashamed of it, and I'm done with it. Her husband took her hand, squeezing it supportively. One by one, others stood, people who'd remained silent, who'd cooperated out of fear, who'd told themselves there was no other choice. I was denied a loan to expand my shop because I wouldn't give Blackwood exclusive supplier rights, a merchant admitted. He threatened to destroy my reputation if I sold cattle to anyone but his buyers, a rancher added. He told me my daughter couldn't work at his ranch unless I voted his way on the council, another voice called out. The testimonies came faster, building on each other, creating a damning portrait of systematic abuse. Blackwood looked around wildly, seeing his carefully constructed power structure collapsing. You're all fools, he spat. Without me, this town is nothing. I brought investment, jobs, growth. You brought tyranny, Caleb said quietly, but his voice carried. You built an empire on fear and called it progress. But empires fall, Mr. Blackwood, especially ones built on foundations this rotten. The vote, when it came, was overwhelming. The town council, now bolstered by public pressure, moved to investigate Blackwood's business practices, review contracts for improprieties, and establish community oversight of land acquisitions and loan decisions. They couldn't undo what had been done, but they could prevent it from continuing. Blackwood stormed out, his remaining supporters trailing behind, but their numbers had dwindled dramatically. What had seemed like majority support revealed itself as minority intimidation once people found the courage to stand together. As the meeting dispersed, people approached Caleb and Lydia, some to apologize, some to offer support, some simply to shake their hands and thank them for having the courage to speak first. You did it, Mrs. Thornton said, gripping Lydia's shoulders. You crazy brave fools actually did it. We all did it, Lydia corrected. Every person who stood up, who shared their story, who chose courage over comfort. Walter appeared with paperwork. The bank's board met in emergency session. Blackwood's been removed as majority investor. Your loan terms are secure, and we're offering rebuilding assistance for the fire damage. Caleb stared at the papers, scarcely believing. We can actually keep the ranch? You can keep the ranch. Hell, with Blackwood out of the way, you'll probably thrive. Others too. The playing field's been leveled considerably. They walked out of the town hall into afternoon sunshine that seemed brighter than before. The weight that had pressed down on them for months had lifted, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to joy. Morrison approached hesitantly. Blackwood's threatening to sue me for breach of contract. Says I spoke against him in bad faith. Let him try, Walter said. His legal position just got a lot weaker. Besides, I've got a good lawyer who'd be happy to take your case pro bono. Over the following weeks, Coldwater transformed. Blackwood left town, unable to face the community that had rejected him. His properties were sold off, distributed among multiple buyers to prevent another monopoly. New businesses opened. The town council implemented transparency measures. People who'd been cowed for years rediscovered their voices. The Rourke Ranch flourished. With the loan secure and community support, they rebuilt better than before. Caleb hired 2 steady hands, allowing him time to finally learn reading from Lydia in the evenings. They expanded the herd, improved the land, built a proper home to replace the cabin. But the real transformation was in them. Caleb smiled more, laughed easier, touched Lydia freely and often. She grew confident, spoke her mind without apology, wore dresses she actually liked rather than ones meant to hide her body. They were still broken in places. Old wounds didn't heal overnight, but they were broken together, which somehow made the fractures feel less like weakness and more like proof they'd survived. On a spring morning, 6 months after the meeting, Lydia stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Caleb emerged behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how far we've come. About the woman who stepped off that train expecting nothing and how much she would marvel at this life. Do you ever regret it, answering that advertisement? Not for a second. You? Not for a second." He turned her to face him. "Though I still can't believe you chose me." "I didn't choose you because you were perfect. I chose you because you were honest, because you saw me, really saw me, and didn't look away." She kissed him softly. "Best decision I ever made." "Second best," he corrected. "What was first?" "Deciding to fight. Deciding we were worth more than survival." He looked out at the ranch, at everything they'd built and defended. "This life we have, it's not just about the land or the work. It's about proving that people like us, people who don't fit the molds others create, can build something beautiful anyway." "Something real," Lydia agreed. "Something real," he echoed. They stood together as the sun climbed higher, warming a world that had tried to break them and failed. The frontier was still harsh, the work was still relentless, and there would be new challenges ahead. But they'd learned something that the Blackwoods of the world would never understand. True strength wasn't the absence of vulnerability. It was the courage to be vulnerable anyway, to love fiercely in a world that punished softness, to stand together when standing alone was safer. In the distance, smoke rose from the Morrison Ranch. Not fire, but cooking smoke from a family reclaiming their land after buying it back at fair price. Closer, they could see Mrs. Thornton's wagon heading toward town, probably full of supplies for the new merchants she'd helped establish. The world was full of people finding their courage, remaking their lives, refusing to settle for less than they deserved. And it had started here, with two unlikely people who'd made a bargain in a harsh land and turned it into something neither had dared dream of. A marriage built not on desperation,